Hi, my name is Sumana Harihareswara. I worked for 4 years for the Wikimedia Foundation, and that's the capacity that many of you know me in, if you know me. But I am now of ChangeSet Consulting, which is open for business. This is a talk about what should we stop doing. And this is, I'm very honored to be speaking to a room full of people who know a lot more about metrics, collectively, surely, than I do. But I want to start by telling you a story and then give you some tools to help you say no and help you help other people say no to things you don't really need to be doing. So when I had just started at the Wikimedia Foundation, in one of my weekly one-on-ones with my boss, Rob Lanphier, I told him that I felt overwhelmed. And he gave me some really good advice. One, he said, you've only been here 8 months. Everybody's still learning for their first year. It takes a year to get up to speed on Wikimedia stuff, so it's fine. Another was, part of why you feel overwhelmed is that you're actually empowered here, that you wouldn't be if you were cog number 12,000 at Apple. But another thing that he told me was that Wikimedia was in the wonderful and terrible position that we would have more good ideas than we could effectively follow up on. And that we had to learn the skill of saying, that's a great idea and we're not doing it. That is a feeling, the feeling of being empowered, but the feeling of also having the terrible responsibility to say no to things that are good ideas, but that aren't the things we should be focusing on, that I think some of you also have. Am I right that some of you have the feeling that you need to be able to say no to some things and maybe you don't quite feel enough will or skill to say no to the right things or the wrong things?
Horrible.
It's horrible. It's horrible. So I want to give you a couple of thoughts and approaches on 3 approaches, if I may, about how to say no, how to help other people in your organization say no. First, notice when you are committing the lamppost fallacy and start saying no to approaches based on it. The lamppost fallacy is understood as the one where someone who's drunk has dropped their keys and is looking for them under a lamppost. Someone else tries to help, comes along and says, oh, is that where you dropped your keys? No, I dropped them under the tree. Well, then why are you looking under the lamppost? Well, the light is better here. Metrics are very prone to the lamppost fallacy, where we take a look at what is easy to measure and forget that that's a bad proxy for the kinds of things we're actually interested in. So earlier in the FLOSS metrics set of conferences, Dave Neary in 2014 mentioned in the What You Measure is What You Get Stories of Metrics Gone Wrong talk that you do need to use qualitative and quantitative analysis to interpret your metrics. You know, when it comes to developer experience, which is a very key thing that many people here in this room care about, you can be analytical while being both quantitative and qualitative. Don't just go with the numbers that are easy to get using automated tools. You sort of have to be, because as soon as you start uncovering numbers, you start asking why they are what they are and what can be done to change that. And that's where the qualitative analytical approach comes in. And qualitative can still be really analytical. I would say that, I would quote here Camille Fournier, who has a post, qualitative or quantitative, but always analytical. Qualitative is still analytical. You may not be able to use data-driven reasoning because you're starting something new and there are no numbers. It's hard to do quantitative analysis without data, and new things only have secondary data about potential in markets. They do not have primary data about the actual user engagement with the unbuilt product that you can measure. Furthermore, even when the thing is released, you probably have nothing but small data for a while. If you only have 1,000 people engaging with something, it is hard to do interesting and statistically significant A/B tests unless you change things drastically and cause massive behavioral changes. And this is applicable to developer experience as well, not just product user experience. The Wikimedia movement has many flaws, but one thing that it has invested in that I think has worked out is a learning and evaluation process and office that tries to help Wikimedians who are doing outreach and Wikimedians who are trying to change trends that aren't working, like the editor decline. This Program and Evaluation Office tries to help people understand how to do research and what metrics to pay attention to. And qualitative is not versus quantitative. They show that it's complementary. Ethnography, case studies, participant observation, and so on help you deepen your understanding and is complementary with a quantitative side, which is about generalizing findings. So Jesus mentioned earlier the many communities that we need to pay attention to in free and open source software: developer, contributor, user, larger ecosystem. And yeah, the developer side has artifacts and process that are a lot easier to see. The light is better there, and it's more quantifiable. But what is actually important to your project? If you ask yourself, what are the strengths and the weaknesses and the opportunities and the threats, if you start, doing the things that we do when we're trying to understand what a project is doing on a strategic level, on a holistic level, where are the places where you're not achieving your larger goals, your missions? A lot of the time, the developer workflow is not as big a problem, as big a red alarm, an alarm as something like the fact that usability isn't so great. We know some things about how to get better at getting that kind of data, qualitative data often about, for instance, usability, or how easy is it to install your product. If you're more of a server-end product, then how easy is it for a system administrator to actually install it? So this is where I'm trying to include a help slide for each of these three approaches or tools. In case this is an approach that rings a bell with you, you might want to consider looking at the Simply Secure guides on doing qualitative user experience research, such as seeing how users are using your product or application. I will be prettying up my notes and turning them into something that has links that can be clicked on, and I'll be circulating that on Monday, so you don't necessarily need to write things like this down. And existing research on software engineering, like the findings in the book, Making Software What Really Works and Why We Believe It. These are good places to start looking to understand how to get around or beyond the Lamppost fallacy. Here's another tool or approach to help you and your org say no. Know what kind of assessment you're trying to do and how it plays into your theory of change. So this is an idea from educational psychology especially. The idea that there's formative assessment or evaluation, and there's summative assessment or evaluation. And anyone here who knows those terms much more deeply, please feel free to correct me and tell me about what I got wrong on the nuances in the Q&A afterwards. But I would say that the part of it is, if you are trying to gather metrics or statistics to do formative evaluation or assessment, this is diagnostic, because you're in the midst of iterative change. You're using it to help students and teachers make better decisions, to help students learn better. Summative assessment is about checking the outcomes at the conclusion of an exercise, a course, an initiative, often for accountability, to judge the worth and the value of that intervention. And for us, I think this might ring a bit of a bell because we so often conflate the metrics that we're trying to use to help guide us as we help a community do its work better, and the ones that are all about performance assessment, sometimes for us, to persuade our bosses or our communities that we're doing a good job, or that someone else is doing a bad job. Man, no laughter at that. Is this something that we can approach in any kind of consistent way? I don't know. When I look at what we talk about in our, I wasn't able to actually attend any of the previous FLOSS metrics talks, but I've looked at your slides. I've, where possible, looked at what you've said, what we've said. Don Foster last year, talking about your metric strategy, mentioned that we should measure progress spot trends and recognize contributors. We should focus on goals to start, so you avoid a mess, measure the right things, and encourage good behavior. Joanna Shurian actually last year talked about measuring the right things, specific goals that will contribute to your organization's success. Dave Neary in 2014 talking about being careful what you measure because metrics create incentives and you should focus on business and community success measurements. But it's very difficult, at least in my experience, to try to create a place for formative assessment and say, this is something I'm trying to measure to help us do better, and to carve away a space for that where it won't get latched onto by people who are trying to make summative assessments of what we're doing and say, aha, there is a signal that this entire intervention, this entire initiative needs a much larger rehauling. It can be difficult to make that case. One way to think about this is in terms of a theory of change. One way to try to carve out the space for doing what it is you're trying to do is that you have an assessment of the way that the world is, you have a vision of how you want the world to look, and you have a hypothesis about some change that you can make, an activity, an intervention you can perform to move us closer from A to B. And so if you can try to structure and frame the discourse around the measurements you're making around that and say, okay, these are measurements that are meant to assess in the whole where we are now and the assessments that we will make at the end, and then here are things that are much more inch pebbles and milestones along the way. But there's a chicken and egg problem here because how do you form the hypothesis without doing any kind of initial measurement? And my perhaps subversive answer is try using ideas from other communities, plus your gut, and plus research that you've already read to create a hypothesis, and then set up experiments to check it. And if you don't already have a bunch of measurements in place, use those to structure what measurements you will do. And so here's some thoughts on ways you could go if this is something that strikes you as an approach that will help you say no to bad, thoughtless initial measurement or measurement that conflates summative and formative. Try looking at the world of educational psychology, such as cognitive apprenticeship theory, and in my notes I'll include a link to a pretty good introduction to educational psychology by researcher Mel Chua. And Wikimedia's programming grant learning and evaluation findings are pretty useful on this and have a bunch of little sub-modules and training that you can go through to help you understand how to structure these things in a way that doesn't conflate things that ought not be conflated. And then this might be one of the hardest ones on just a psychological level, which is saying no. Acknowledging failure. If something doesn't work, actually acknowledge it. If you try something, if your community is currently doing something and you find out that it does not have the effects that you wanted it to have, once you've actually gathered this data, having the will to say, okay, I'm going to use this data to say no, to maybe make some people feel temporarily bad. We experienced this at the Wikimedia Foundation. We found out that one-off edit-a-thons, where you get new people to create and contribute content on particular topics that they're interested in, well, about 15% maybe of those people were still editing 6 months after the event. Inviting contribution by surfacing geo-targeted little articles to, for instance, editors in the Philippines was not enough to motivate or help users to make their first edits to an article. And providing suggestions via links to places users might go for help didn't seem to really help. You got to take these bug reports when you find out something that you did isn't working. And one thing you can do is move the goalposts. One thing you can do is you can start redefining what you did as success by some new measure. And if that's something that you actually discover along the way of doing some kind of experiment and measuring as you go, that, oh, there was this other good that happened. If that's a genuine thing that happened, then sure, acknowledge that. But try to recognize in yourself and your organization the urge to reduce the cognitive dissonance that happens when you find out that you do a thing and it wasn't the right thing to do. when we do something, there is this urge, right, to cognitive consonance that, well, I did this thing, therefore it must have been a good thing to do. And a way to reduce that cognitive dissonance is to start from the beginning, be willing to make hypotheses and follow them up, and say, all right, we planned this thing. Here's how we would know if it was working or not. This is how we knew it wasn't working. There might have been some assumptions, some issues with our assumption, and therefore this is what I'll change next time. Or we think this went wrong and this is how to fix it. I'm not just talking about things that other people do. I'm also talking about things that we ourselves find emotionally satisfying to do. I think we need, for instance, more research about mentorship programs. I myself am a huge supporter of mentorship programs like Outreachy, formerly OPW, and Google Summer of Code and UCOSP. And there's a little bit of research from 2015 from Adrian Lebouzagne and Reed Holmes that maybe these, especially like easy first bug programs and things like that, maybe don't lead to as much long-term retention as we were hoping. I personally am going to try to follow up and read as much more of this kind of research as I can, because I think it's important for us to acknowledge when things that we feel satisfying, things like parties, things like hackathons, things like mentorship programs, maybe aren't as effective as they need to be. I think the jury's still out on a bunch of this, but we need to look at them more. And on a larger scale, there's existing research that we need to look at and not just all work in our own silo. And there's a much larger question that I want to leave myself and other people with, which is that there's a trend I see underlying a big chunk of FLOSS metrics work, which is the desire to automate away the emotional labor involved in maintainership, like figuring out how our fellow contributors are doing, seeing from their contribution patterns, intuiting it that way instead of doing relationship building work, or making choices about where to spend mentorship time and code review time, or tracking a community's emotional tenor in general. Is that actually appropriate? What if we switched our assumptions around and used our metrics to figure out what we're spending time on more generally, and, for instance, took the approach that there's probably a bunch of low-value programming work and sysadmin work that we could stop doing? And what if we focused metrics on that? And what tools would support that? And what scenarios could play out there? This is, to me, a pretty large question that I started thinking about as I was preparing this keynote and couldn't approach with any level of sophistication, because I feel like I don't yet have the vision building and the scenarios and the tools and the research to think about that in a really deep way. But I would love to hear and think more about that. So here are some thoughts on things that we should stop doing. It's, in a sense, a matter of being willing to set priorities in our own lives, in our organizations, and in our projects, having the skill and the will to sometimes say no so that we can focus on doing the things that actually need doing and building the skills to do them well. So I think I have about a minute for questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.